Fraud is no longer just a risk for auto dealers, it has become part of everyday operations. Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect solution helps you catch income, identity, and trade-in fraud in real time without slowing down the sale. Stop fraud. Keep deals moving. Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Monday, May 18th, 2026. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, automakers and suppliers finally getting along better. Why automakers are backing away from selling driving data, and Dongfeng will build cars at a Stellantis factory in France. Plus, used EV sales surged in April. Two experts talk about why and what it means for the broader EV market.
I think the trust and transparency is increasing, and consumers are getting more comfortable with buying a used EV, knowing that that battery has a warranty or that it's going to last for a long time.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. It's finally happening. Automakers and their suppliers are actually getting along better. For the first time in 26 years, all 6 automakers tracked in Plant Moran's annual survey improved their relationships with parts suppliers, and this is happening while the industry's dealing with tariffs and billions in EV write-downs. Angela Johnson from Plant Moran says suppliers are giving automakers credit for just picking up the phone and hearing them out, even if they didn't always get the help they wanted. Toyota topped the list for the 17th straight year, while Ford showed the biggest improvement. Remember when automakers thought selling your driving data was going to be a gold mine? Turns out, not so much. A new survey from Omdia and Sonatus shows the industry is backing away from data sales. And when you look at the numbers, you can see why. Honda made 26 cents per car from selling driver data between 2020 and 2024. That's according to information automakers sent to Senators Ron Wyden and Ed Markey. 26 cents. Add in regulatory crackdowns and angry customers, and automakers are deciding there are better ways to use all that vehicle data, like improving driver assistance systems and predictive maintenance. And China's Dongfeng will build cars at Stellantis' French factory in Rennes. According to France Info, it's a first for a Chinese automaker producing at scale in France. The plant has about 40,000 units of excess capacity. Bloomberg reports that the move helps Dongfeng avoid EU tariffs, and it's part of Stellantis' broader plan to address overcapacity. Our own Jake Neer spoke with Automotive News Europe editor Peter Siegel about it. He reached Peter at his home office outside Paris.
Peter Siegel, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Thanks, Jake. It's great to be here as usual.
This is a really interesting story, and one of the things that popped out to me is that this comes just days after Stellantis and Dongfeng announced that they're investing over $1 billion to build Jeeps and Peugeots in China. How do those two deals fit together, if at all, in sort of the bigger picture of their partnership?
Yeah, I think they fit together. Just to quickly circle back to the beginnings, PSA Group, which merged with Fiat Chrysler to form Stellantis, set up a joint venture in China with Dongfeng in the early 90s. And it was actually really successful. They eventually got to the point where they had 4 factories. They were building Peugeots and Citroëns and also cars for Dongfeng. But at one point, PSA was selling 734,000 cars a year in China. It was their biggest market. This was around 2016 or 2017. Because of structural shifts in the Chinese market, that number started going down drastically. And I think this year, Stellantis had a grand total of 10 to 15,000 cars in the Chinese market. So, the partnership was almost nowhere. Dongfeng wanted to revive it, and they started by announcing this partnership in China where they're going to build 2 Jeep models and 2 Peugeot models for the Chinese market and for export. They didn't say where they were going to export them, but it's a good bet that obviously Southeast Asia. And so the next bit of news, and again, this was just a report, but apparently the sourcing's pretty good. We didn't do the reporting. It was a French outlet, but so they're going to they've given some capacity in a plant in Western France to Dongfeng. They've got I think 40,000 extra units in this factory. It only builds a single Citroën model. It's kind of out there geographically, so it makes sense. But it does show that this partnership is, still alive and kicking. And also, just one other point: At one point in the mid 2012, 13, 14, Dongfeng had 14% of PSA. PSA almost went bankrupt and Dongfeng bailed them out. Most of that stake was sold when Stellantis was formed, but they know each other. That's sort of the long and short of it.
So, Peter, that leads me to maybe the bigger question here, which is, what are European automakers doing about overcapacity right now?
Yeah, so it's a huge question. Stellantis is the main offender, if you will. I believe they've got about 1 million extra units. But the larger problem is that since pre-COVID times, 2019, the European auto market has gone down by 3 million units a year. It is politically very difficult to close factories in Europe. We've had a few since then, but the problem has not been fully addressed. Renault closed a factory near Paris. Audi closed a factory in Brussels, which Automotive News has reported on. And just a couple of weeks ago, Stellantis announced they would stop building cars at one of their factories near Paris. And they are also going to dedicate a factory in Madrid, Spain, to their Chinese partner, Leapmotor. They're going to share more capacity in a different Spanish factory with Leapmotor. So, it's a real problem. And Stellantis' solution is we're going to partner with our Chinese partners and let them take over some of the some of the space. There's also been talk about BYD, perhaps in Italy. Not sure that's going to go anywhere. But for a Chinese company, you have these high-tech factories that just aren't being used enough. So we call them brownfield factories. Greenfield is when you start with virgin turf. But so it's very attractive. I mean, and it does solve a problem. I mean, there are, of course, the larger question is, sort of the fox and the hen house thing. Chinese automakers are making great strides in China. And if you give them an opportunity to build here to avoid some tariffs, the outcome may not be exactly what you want, but it will preserve employment. And that's important too.
So really quick before we end off here, I think, for our mostly American audience listening, maybe the question is, okay, so Stellantis has this really close relationship with Dongfeng and other automakers from China. What does that mean for their ability or interest in bringing that to the U.S. market in any way? But this is probably sort of a separate story. Is that fair?
Yes, to a point. And then it's probably very tempting for Stellantis to say, we could repeat this in the U.S. with the right models, with the right partners. We could offer some of these cars at a very attractive price. We wouldn't have to develop, EVs because they're already there. It wouldn't detract from their core market, which is, larger pickups, Jeeps, things like that. The idea has been floated in Canada. Could we build kit cars, complete knockdown kits, as we call them, in Canada, in Brampton, I believe? And the answer from the Canadian government or from the unions is no, absolutely not. But Automotive News' Dave Kennedy had a great column recently where he said this is sort of a bargaining chip. I mean, this doesn't completely preclude the notion that there could be some sort of partnership in Canada, because Canada is going to allow some Chinese cars there. And, one thing that Chinese cars do is they can help solve the affordability crisis, because if they're built in China, they're built at much lower cost. So, it's in the US, it's probably a non-starter for the moment because of tariffs and politics. But I wouldn't totally rule out Canada. And once it happens in Canada, maybe there's administration change in the U.S., things change. Stellantis is well positioned. They do, of all the automakers, especially in the U.S., they probably work the most closely with the Chinese now that GM is sort of de-emphasized, Buick a bit, and Ford is out of China. So they're well positioned.
It seems like every auto story, no matter where in the globe, is becoming a global auto story in the last year or so. But the good news with that is we get to talk with our own Peter Siegel more often over in France. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on Daily Drive. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
It was a pleasure, Jake. See you next time.
Coming up next, a conversation about the surge in used EV sales. That's next on Daily Drive.
Fraud is no longer just a risk for auto dealers. It has become part of everyday operations. According to Experian Automotive, nearly 9 out of 10 dealers say fraud is a top concern, and 70% say it's on the rise. We're talking about real deals slipping through, costing dealerships $10,000, even $20,000 per incident. And it's not just one type of fraud. You've got forged income documents, fabricated salaries, synthetic identities, even trade-in scams. The worst part? Catching fraud often slows everything down, adding friction to deals and frustrating legitimate customers. That's where Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect solution comes in. It's designed specifically for dealers, helping you quickly detect income, identity, and trade-in ownership before it hits your bottom line. No guesswork, no unnecessary delays, just faster, more consistent verification so you can protect your profits while keeping the buying experience smooth. Because the goal isn't just to stop fraud, it's to keep good deals moving. Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect. No more. Risk less. Sell smarter.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Kellen Walker. Used electric vehicle sales grew 17% year over year in April, even as new EV sales dropped more than 23%. Elena Ciccatelli, host of the EVs for Everyone podcast, and Stephanie Valdez-Streety, director of industry insights at Cox Automotive, spoke with our own Molly Boygon on the latest episode of the Automotive News Shift podcast. They talked about the data and what's driving the gap between new and used EV sales. Here's a piece of that conversation.
Let's start with data hot off the presses from Cox Automotive about new and used EV sales for the month of April. So used sales grew 3% month over month and nearly 17% year over year. And meanwhile, new sales dropped 6.2% from March to April and more than 23% from last year. EVs are now a share of the total new vehicle market that has dropped to its lowest point since late 2021. So, Stephanie, what is going on with new EV sales? I was struck in particular by the 23% year over year drop from last year.
Yeah, I think, if you look about last year, a lot of volatility with policy. And so we need Q3, right? The IRA expired, record quarter, Q4 drop, Q1 of this year. So I think 2026 is still a year of trying to figure out what that normal demand for EVs is. And so I think that's what we're seeing right now. But also, I think if you look back, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market right now, right? There's the war that's going on, high gas prices. If the duration lasts, that could, I think, ultimately help EVs. But there's a lot of headwinds right now. And I think that's what's causing the slowdown in EV adoption. But meanwhile, we have infrastructure that's really growing. So I think it's just the time that we're in, adjusting to the new norm. But I'm excited about some of the new models that are launching this year that I think are really going to help later in the year from Toyota and Subaru.
When you talk about the headwinds, are you referring to consumer confidence, or what other types of things are you thinking about as headwinds to that new vehicle adoption?
Yeah, you think consumer sentiment, right? Like the University of Michigan showed the lowest consumer sentiment since June of 2022. And so when you have consumer sentiment that drops, that leads to consumer spending drop. And so I think for a consumer right now, if you don't need to buy a vehicle, you're going to hold off because it's very costly, right? So I think that's what we're also seeing. Consumers are waiting to see what happens. But if you need a car right now, I think the consideration for EVs and other fuel-efficient vehicles is happening.
You also published some new data about the average transaction price for EVs. So year over year, lower by almost 5%. Still pricey, though, at more than $55,000, but an increase from March's ATP. I really don't know what to make of that. You have a year over year decline, but a month over month increase.
Yeah.
So what does that say to you about EV prices these days?
Yeah, when we look at ATP, it's an average, right? But I think it's all about the mix of vehicles sold. So if you look at April, there are a lot of higher value or higher ATP vehicles that were sold. A decline in some of those more affordable. We saw a drop in like the Equinox, BZ, which are better, lower price. So I think it's all about the mix of models that dictates that. So I think at the end of the day, there's still a premium for EVs, and so we just need more affordable EVs to offer for consumers.
Yeah, and speaking of affordability, the used EV market is looking totally different. Elena, I see you nodding along a little bit. So as I mentioned, we saw used EV sales grow 3% month over month, almost 17% year over year. Elena, is that aligned with what you're hearing from the dealer community and others in the auto industry?
Absolutely, yes. And there are a lot of people who took advantage of some of those amazing deals on leases that are not available anymore because the cost of ownership for a new EV, as we were just saying, is just completely unattainable right now. But if you look at some of the used EVs that were leased, that were now, coming off lease, that were purchased about 2 years ago, it's a good chance that it's got less than 15,000 miles on it, looks like a new car, smells like a new car, but it's 40% cheaper. So that's why we're seeing a lot of examples. There's this one particular example of a dealership in Renton, Washington. The dealer's name is Genevieve Carter. She is the owner of Revolve Motors, a woman-owned dealership, by the way. She is saying that she is constantly getting calls from people wanting to come in for a test drive. She said the second half of March was absolutely insane, like just flipped on a switch, and all this demand just started to turn on, and she's expecting for this to continue through the summer. Again, as we had mentioned in the beginning, gas prices are definitely, getting people to think twice about a used EV.
Stephanie, do you think that the used EV market is more sort of susceptible to the influences of gas prices than the new because perhaps these would-be buyers are a little bit more price conscious? Is that what's explaining that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, like Elena said, you have all these off-lease vehicles that are coming. So there's a lot of choice at a really good price point. If you look at the price difference between a used EV and a used gas, it's less than $1,000. So we're getting to price parity. And actually probably like more than 40% of used EVs that are sold are less than 25,000. So it provides access. And then if you think about somebody who can charge at home, lower maintenance, the total cost of ownership is really a strong value proposition, and just a lot of models to choose from. So I think that really is definitely helping. With the high gas prices, used EVs are something to consider. And I also think, Elena, I was at the used car summit, I think that we were both at. I was listening into a dealership panel on used EVs, and they said they started to see a lot of boomers coming in and buying used EVs. So I say all that to say that you have the typical new EV demographic profile. I think for used EV, it's just wide open. So I think for a used dealership or car dealership selling used EVs, there's a lot more target demographic to buy those used EVs.
I was also at that used car industry summit panel. I think all three of us were there at the beautiful Intercontinental Hotel in Miami.
You're right.
Yeah, that's really interesting point, Stephanie. It sort of flips the expectations on its head about what an EV buyer looks like in that used market. And it also makes me wonder if I remember last year, there was a lot of concern, at least articulated by consumers to the press, about the used EV battery fear that people were going to have to replace an EV battery. I wonder if it feels to you, both of you, like that concern has been assuaged somewhat, or there's more consumer education around that issue or something. Stephanie, do you feel like that's less of an issue for buyers these days, or whatever happened to that?
Yeah, I definitely think the industry is building trust and transparency around the battery. We have Mannheim auctions where we see a lot of used EVs going through the auction, and we do a state of health assessment. The batteries are really good. And so I think having that information when you're looking at a used EV, if you're going to purchase, whether you're a dealership buying it at the auction or a consumer buying it. The other thing too is I think we're starting to get better at educating consumers about the battery warranty. We did a survey a couple of years ago. I think it was like 30% of the respondents weren't aware that there's a warranty, 8 to 10 years, 100,000 miles on the battery. So I think the trust and transparency is increasing, and consumers are getting more comfortable with buying a used EV, knowing that battery has a warranty or that it's going to last for a long time.
Elena Ciccatelli of the EVs for Everyone podcast and Stephanie Valdez-Streety of Cox Automotive spoke with our own Molly Boygan. You can hear the full conversation on the latest episode of Shift, available now wherever you get your podcasts. That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer, as well as our own John Irwin and Molly Boygan for their reporting for today's podcast. We also had reporting from Peter Siegel of our sibling publication, Automotive News Europe. You can get the latest news on automaker supplier relations, used EV sales, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back tomorrow for a conversation with Steve Greenfield, General Partner of Automotive Ventures. about the latest do's and don'ts for dealers looking for AI vendors.
If I'm going to spend more on AI solutions that are trying to sell to me, where am I going to make trade-offs and start reducing my budget elsewhere? And that, I think, as a dealer, isn't very clear to me yet.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.